Welcome everybody to the webinar Best Practices for Securing Continuous Delivery for Jenkins, Argo, and Spinnaker. My name is Mark Levy, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. I focus on product marketing here at OpsMx. Before we start, a few housekeeping items. The session will be about 45 minutes long. We are recording the session. We'll send the recording and the slides to everyone. And if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat and we'll answer all the questions that we can. So what I'd like to do now is introduce our presenter, Bob Boulay, who's the VP of Product Management at OpsMx. I've worked with Bob for a couple of years now, and he is like uniquely qualified to talk about this topic because he is an expert really in three areas. He knows continuous delivery really well. He understands and has worked in the security space, and he's an expert in Jenkins, Argo, and Spinnaker. So he has over two decades actually as a solution engineer. Bob, how you doing?
I'm hanging in, my friend, and I'm glad to be here today, and looking forward to our session. So,
what do we got today?
I think, guys, let me jump right in. So an overview of what we want to accomplish in today's session, guys, as we move through this. I want to walk through some of the expectations of the modern software solution provider. Really, talk a little bit about what customers are asking for and demanding as it relates to that end result of your deployments, right? So, if you're a software factory and you're producing software for customers, or if you're on the other side of that equation, where you're consuming software, what are you demanding, and what are the things that you're expecting, from a security perspective and from a quality perspective from the vendors that you're working with. I want to talk a little bit about secure software delivery in these contexts, right? So what is it? What are we talking about? And then obviously, one of the things that I always like to talk about in these types of sessions is, all the ecosystem around continuous integration, continuous delivery, and just the general production of software or the distribution of software. It is a large scenario. There's lots of tooling out there, right? All of them doing their particular job and doing it very well in most cases. And we expect you as a consumer of those tools to have confidence in them. But I think one of the things that we're going to be talking about here today is, how do I take that crush of data, all of that information that I'm getting from these various tools that I'm using, and make it context aware? How do I make it policy aware? How do I make it security aware, right? And that might sound a little odd because a lot of these tools are security tools, but how many of them are able to really sort of understand their role, the role that their data plays in that distribution? And really, I think the idea behind this is, in terms of how we think OpsMx can help here, is that constant struggle between delivering at velocity. You guys caught one of my typos there, as velocity. But really, how do I do this in a safe and automated fashion? How do I audit the delivery of that software? If any of you that have spent time working in, sort of a SaaS environment or a heavily regulated environment, where you've had the pleasure of going through an ISO 27001 audit, that you can't just show up for your interview with the auditor and say, yeah, we do all these things. They say, show me, right? I don't know if all auditors are from Missouri, but they say, show me. And they want to see what it is that you're doing and how you're doing it. And so having not only the ability to do all these things, but also to be able to document them and be able to sort of prove the efficacy of those releases becomes critically important. And again, depending on what side of the equation you're on. Now, as we go into this, we start looking at customer expectations, consumer expectations, right? So SaaS or self-managed expectations, they don't change, right? But with SaaS vendors, the speed to risk is real, right? So if I'm a SaaS vendor and I've got 500 customers on my platform versus 150 self-managed, when I release the self-managed piece, I'm going to have a chance to watch as my customers go to adopt that upgrade or adopt that new feature release. with SaaS, I'm going to put that out there. Now I can do things like canaries, and I can do phased in rollouts and be looking for problems. But even in that case, the minute I roll this out, those risks are real, right? And so, again, I think if we look toward that traditional SaaS model where we want continuous delivery, we want to be adding value to customers by continuously releasing bug fixes, security patches, new features to these customers. You can't escape the fact that you want to do that at velocity. How do you make that secure? How do you make sure that that is not going to create a risk, or you're not generating a problem that didn't exist? More and more solutions, they must add value. The consumer of that needs to be able to trust the solution, right? So any of you that have answered a security questionnaire as a SaaS operator understand that piece of it, right? Like, you'll get 200 question questionnaire. They want to know everything that you're doing with regard to that. They're doing that for a reason, right? They are, looking at you as an extension of their enterprise, based on the types of tooling they're going to use from you. And so I think, the idea behind this is that those software solutions are also leveraging more and more of their customers' data in order to provide value. So I now am in a position where I could potentially become the steward of some of my customers' data. Not all the time, but there are cases where that is the case. And we want to make sure that you need to make sure that you're buttoned up when, a customer trusts you with that information. And, I think that, again, I think I mentioned this earlier, the solution really a lot of times is going to be, whether it's self-managed or SaaS, is going to be considered an extension of the customer's infrastructure. So they're going to have a lot of direct questions. They're going to want to understand the process. And again, you really need to be buttoned up on that, but you can't, it's difficult because the market's not going to allow you to slow down. You can't say, hey, I'm going to deliver a release and new features to you twice a year, only twice a year, but it'll be secure as heck, right? The market wants both, right? They want velocity, they want safety. And again, I think the solutions providers must consider security and compliance concerns. You have no choice now. We've seen enough attacks, in terms of the software supply chain, where this is top of mind for the majority of CISOs that are out there, the majority of VPs of engineering or chief technology officers, both folks that are consuming and folks that are producing. And so they want to make sure that this is really something that's considered by the software publisher. And this also applies to any internal software you happen to be using as well, by the way. I think that goes without saying, but I wanted to make sure that that I covered that particular point. So I think, as we look at the attack vectors as part of that workflow, and this is a very high level diagram, by the way. I am well aware that these workflows can be much more complicated. However, when we start to look at this abstraction, I think we start to see, where the attack vectors might be, right? And of course, I think from our perspective on the OpsMx side, we don't want to consider ourselves in that business of producing tools that will ultimately, sort of help defend you against this. There are already tools out there that are very well done, that are being leveraged probably by most of you today, that will help you do these things. I think from our perspective, as we look across this set of attack vectors, what we want to do is we want to add some intelligence here. We want to make sure that we're the connective tissue between the tooling that you're using to identify bad code, something like a static or dynamic code analysis, versus the pieces that are included around making sure there's no after your build or after your pipeline is run, injection of bad artifacts, right? So we want to help you start to collect all that information as those tools do their job, right? And then ultimately allow you to set policy. So if you have an SDLC that you've worked on and developed, and it's a set of standards that you want to make sure are being followed, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're the piece there that connects all of that tooling to that SDLC to make it easier and simpler for you to be able to do this. And quite frankly, with that comes a lot of things like alerting and avoiding alert fatigue. Things like exception handling, right? So how do you want to handle exceptions pre-release or pre-deploy? How do you want to monitor through something we'll talk about at a different time, but the deployment bill of materials. So what was deployed? Where was it deployed? When was it deployed, right? And then ultimately have a historical artifact that documents all these things, that documents the fact that a policy check was run against all of the data that we collected about this release. The only time we drag humans into it is to get exceptions, right? Or to mitigate risks, right? So, but that tool we're almost like a firewall from that perspective to make sure that the data that's being ingested by the various tools that you're using are looking to help you avoid some of the things that you see here that we're considering all that information. And again, I think, as we look at this and we start to break this up into certain capabilities, when we look at things like prevent, right? So prevent, resolve, and secure. With our prevent phase, we're looking at policy enforcement, right? We're saying, hey, left of the deployment, have we taken in all the data from the various tool sets, vulnerability management tools, code quality tools, all those tools that you're using to ensure that the release the release candidate is safe and ready to go. Are we bumping that up against policy? Are we evaluating that from an automated perspective to make sure that we're doing things like image integrity checks? And that might be in the use case of, hey, I'm actually deploying off-the-shelf software, and I want to make sure that the images that I'm grabbing from the vendor's repo are indeed the images that they published, right? So it's whether it be a checksum check or there's a signed image using a public-private key type of scenario. So we want to make sure that those things have been done, right? We don't want to stop the process and go and look, right? We want to add a layer of automation that allows us to do that. Things like vulnerability tracing, code vulnerability alerts, introduction of net new dependencies that are there, right? So again, bringing that information into the platform and bumping that up against a set of policies, and then basically bringing people back to the fold for things like exception handling. And then secure is really around the deployment bill of materials. What got deployed? When was it deployed? Where is it? Can I ingest information on ongoing? One thing we know about things like vulnerability management is that's an ongoing battle. That's not a static world at all. Just because I've deployed something doesn't mean the life cycle around vulnerabilities popping up inside of it is over, right? So we want to make sure that we're continuing to sort of do that post-deployment or right of deploy. We give you options to do that. Again, we're not looking to replace tooling. We're looking to actually make sure we're ingesting data and facilitating that work. And let me go ahead here and move ahead with my slides. So this is what this, and again, I'm a visual person, so I like to use slides like this. I know this slide's really busy, but if you think about what we're doing here as a walkthrough is, from our perspective, we've got tooling that will synthesize the delivery process. So we'll reach out to Jenkins, Spinnaker, Argo, pull in the pipeline data from the CD system, synthesize the pipeline run, and extract all the needed information, or go fetch the needed information that's associated with that pipeline run through the tooling that you've chosen to connect up to our product. We're looking at things like vulnerability management, thinking about things like code quality or dynamic and static code analysis, tools like Rapid7 or SonarQube or things of that nature, where we're going out and actually bringing in the information that they've generated based on these things and understanding and interpreting that information. But ultimately, what we're doing is we're giving you a system that will take that data and make it actionable through a set of policies, right? So we're going to coordinate and really sort of bring together all the information that you're interested in or the tooling that you have to ensure that you're producing secure software we're taking that and bumping that up against a set of policies. That set of policies might come from your SDLC. It might come from the fact that you've just been through a ISO 27001 audit, and you want to make sure that you're able to produce evidence on an ongoing basis that the deployments meet this criteria. You might be responsible for deploying to a third party's cloud. So you might be responsible to deploying directly to your customer's cloud. So you want, an attestation there. You want a delivery chain, supply chain traceability. So you want to be able to go ahead and actually make sure that those checks and balances that have been performed are indeed documented. So again, I think if you think about this and think about what we're offering as a data aggregator for all these things, and then adding an intelligence layer to interpret that data and also make sure that the data that's being used is used to evaluate that release against that set of policies. Now, the other piece of this is, when everything goes right, this is simple, right? It's going to come through. We're going to do the evaluation. We're going to go ahead and bump that up against policies. Everything checks out. We can go ahead and move forward, right? However, it gets more complicated when you start to have to deal with exceptions, when things that we're seeing are not quite what we were expecting. And so, but not every one of those things needs to be a blocker, right? You may have cases where something is there, but someone has taken a look at it and decided this is not exploitable in our context. We're not using that part of the dependency that was brought in. We're not using that part of the open source code that's being used. So there's always that idea of exceptions. And so having a system that will document those exceptions and allow you to come in and make those exceptions so that the pipeline can continue. We talked about attestation, audit, and delivery chain traceability. Again, here, it's post. Once you get past your first set of ISO 27001 audits or SOC 2 type of scenarios, where you've sold the auditors on, hey, here's the documentation, here's our policies and procedures. When they come back the next year, they want proof that you're actually following these things. And so we want to make sure that we're providing that, again, as a small data aggregator around all these tools and making sure that you can see the policies that are being applied here and that the release is being checked against these policies. And I think the other operative word here is automation, right? So we're allowing you to operate in a safe manner, but add that velocity that the market is demanding. And then ultimately, when we start thinking about continuous monitoring and alerting post-deployment, that DBOM or that delivery bill of materials, where we know where something was deployed, we know exactly what it was deployed based on all the information that we've gathered, and we can continuously monitor that as well and provide you with a window into what's going on there, and in terms of the data that we've collected and how that's changed over time. Because again, I think the idea behind this is none of this stuff is static, right? For the most part, it's very, very, it's a shifting scale in terms of vulnerability and security pieces. Things are constantly evolving. And so we give you that window into that as well. And so that's kind of what the life cycle of this looks like. And I think, the reason I like this slide is because you think about where OpsMx sort of sits, sort of in the middle of that as almost a business intelligence layer for all this data that it's collecting from the various tools that you're using. So I want to transition now that we've done, sort of an overview. How do we make all the data that's in that delivery chain, or in that sort of CI/CD ecosystem? How do we make it delivery aware, right? And I think I touched on this earlier, but how do I make sure that all these boxes are being checked and that we're not missing something? We can't rely on humans, right? We can't rely on, hey, Mark's going to go pull the report from Sneak, and then someone else is going to go pull the report from Coverity, and someone else is going to look at this. When you start getting too many people in the loop, the process works, but you're subjected to potential human error. You're subjected to, sort of lack of or a decrease in velocity. A lot of these things happen where you don't want to. You want to be able to fully automate. If you make the assumption that everything is going to check out and everything's going to go the way it needs to, those checks will pass and everything will sort of move forward. That's your utopia. If you have to fall back to, there's an exception here, great. You want a tool that you can come into, manage that exception, and then kick things off again, right? So I think that's really where, we're going to walk through some specifics here on some of the things that we can help with there. So this seems like sort of an odd slide to show, but I think the point I want to make here, because I'm always afraid that people walk away from this talk with the idea that we're out there looking to replace the investments that you've already made. And I think the idea behind this is we're absolutely not. We actually want to leverage those investments. We want to bring the information together. We want to bring all the data together. So, if you're using multiples of tools in these categories, or if you're just using a single tool per category, we want to make sure that we're consolidating the data from those things. They do their job and they do it extremely well, right? You've picked that tool, you've picked Sneak, you've picked Rapid7, you've picked Jenkins because of its reputation and it works for your developers. And we don't want to make any changes to that ecosystem at all. What we want to add is a layer of intelligence around the data that those things provide as they do their jobs. So that's why I show this screen here. This is really a snapshot of some of our tool integration and some of the things that we're going to support as we march forward in our journey to help supply that sort of centerpiece, or almost that deployment firewall. Now, some of the specifics around this, and these are sort of general topics, and I chose to grab snapshots of some of the screens that we've got in our current prototype product. But I wanted to talk a little bit about things like source code, right? So, again, for us, being able to, do or pull in source code analysis. We don't want to be the job to be done for us is not to perform the source code analysis. In this case here, this particular thing, it's coming from SonarQube. So, we don't need to do that, but the data is critical, right? The data is critical to the secure software delivery decision that's going to get made here, right? So we want to pull that information in. We want to see things like, the results of that scan. We also want to see things like the commit history and sort of where these things came from, right? We want to be able to interrogate those things and ultimately surface them, because ultimately this is the data that we're going to write policy around. This is the data that we're going to use to bump up against policy and the automation that we need in order to either move forward with a delivery or create an alert, and then ultimately either create an exception or bring someone back that says, hey, we actually need to fix this, we need to stop. And so that's ultimately what our goal is here. But again, I think covering source code is critical. Looking at artifact health and security, right? So as we look at the various artifacts, and I think, for us, again, this is going to be something where we're either going to ingest a tool's SBOM, or that software bill of materials, or if you don't have something like that, we can provide you with some open source alternatives to create this. But I think either way, we want this information in our tool to, again, make an assessment, right? So we want to understand the components. We want to understand what's making up this release or this delivery. We want to understand the vulnerability information associated with this. So what is that, the health of those artifacts? What is, from a vulnerability and from, sort of a publisher and a license perspective. So, again, I spent years in sort of open source software management, right? And I think, especially with larger organizations who are leveraging open source, something simple like, making sure that you've got a policy around the types of licenses that you want to permit within your software is critical, right? And I mean, there's tools out there like Black Duck from Synopsys that will ultimately produce this bill of materials, but we want to make sure that we take that data and make it front and center in terms of evaluation as to whether or not we move forward with a deployment. So again, I think looking at this from a data consolidation and what is actionable, around the data that's being produced by my tooling. So this is another, critical piece there. Looking at the software supply chain and vulnerability assessments. And so this gets, again, to a place where we're going to ingest that information, as you're deploying, and bring that stuff in and ultimately make a determination around sort of, the data that's being reported, and again, bump that up against those policies, right? So again, you can set what those policies are. Those policies could be coming from your SDLC. They could be recommendations from your ISO auditors or your internal security team. But we're gonna, again, take this data. We're gonna go ahead and actually assess the deployment against the data that we've collected from those tools. And again, I think it comes back to reach out in the event that there's an alert that needs to be generated, so that someone will come and evaluate this and either, again, stop this deployment or create an exception. Again, if none of the policies are triggered based on this data, if everything looks clean based on those policies, we could simply just proceed. But again, I think those checks need to be there. Those checks need to be there, and you need to be in control of, sort of the behavior around what happens when something looks out of compliance or is reporting out of compliance. How is that going to be remediated? Again, we talked about policy assessment, right? This is really where the tool becomes very powerful, because now, again, I can go ahead and actually take things straight out of my SDLC, and I can go ahead and ultimately start adding checks. I can monitor, the news and say, hey, my CISO just came down and said, hey, have you heard about this recent attack? Are we insulated? I can now just go ahead and actually look to create policy here. Again, not changing out any of the tools that we're using, not changing those things. There are all best of breeding. You chose them for a reason. But the data that they produce, we want to make sure we add that connective tissue to whether or not they're in violation of any of the policies that you've written or that you're looking to enforce as you produce software. So again, I think this is another area that is critical in terms of making sure that we get to a place where we're ultimately bumping that data up against these policies. And I think the other part of this is alerts. Let's face it, right? Nobody is looking to sit in front of yet another dashboard all day, right? So one of the things that's critical to a solution like this is that ability to bring you back into the fold when there's an exception to be handled, right? So we want to make sure that we're looking at these things. We're taking a critical eye toward, whether or not an actual policy violation is happening. One of the problems with some of the tooling is you get that alert fatigue, or if you are starting to try and get alerts from 10 different tools in your ecosystem versus saying, hey, let's roll all that data up and let's have a single source of truth as to whether or not something needs to be paid attention to. This is really where we think we can add that value. And again, I think, that alerting piece needs to not only bring you back to the tool, but give you the opportunity to take action on that alert, right? Whether you're going to bounce the alert over to another user in the system for evaluation, or you're actually going to create and document an exception. Again, these are things that you're really going to want to do. You're going to want to be able to do that quickly. Again, because we're fighting that double-edged sword around safety and velocity. So we want to make sure that that's available to us and our ability to go ahead and do that. So that's something that I think is hypercritical, but it also goes hand in hand with exception handling, right? Again, I think when we want to talk about how to handle exceptions, or if we know that there is an exception that we need to make based on an evaluation of the problem, right? We don't necessarily want to start all over again, or we don't necessarily need to go out and replace sections of the code where, after doing the research, the vulnerability that's triggering this is not a code path that we're exercising, or there's no exploit for this in the environment that we're deploying it in, right? So we want to make sure that we give you the ability to not only just catch all these things, but on the other side, very quickly decide whether or not you want to invoke an exception, and then ultimately manage those exceptions as you go. So if you, upon further inspection, find out, wow, we probably shouldn't allow for that exception, or going forward after a review, that exception is no longer going to be allowed, we're going to force our development teams to fix that problem, I can go in and revoke that exception. But ultimately, that exception management here is another piece where we're balancing safety, security with velocity. So again, extremely important in that piece. And then I think, the other piece of this is, the quality and security. So again, I think, there are some of us that are in situations where we have to provide attestations to our customers because we're asking them to deploy software in very sensitive environments, or, we want to do this from the perspective of our auditors, and we want to make sure that we've got a record of what was done, when it was done, and the information that was evaluated as part of each release, so that when they come in and they ask, hey, can you, give me information on these 5 random releases, all of that information is here. You're not running around to 10 different systems collecting it and ultimately bringing it all together for that auditor. It makes it nice and simple. Or if you need to, again, present a customer with that attestation, this is a very simple way to go ahead and actually do that as well. And so we want to make sure, because we are collecting all this data, allow you to leverage that from this perspective as well, so that you're not, again, when these things come up, looking for or trying to get to a place where, you're scrambling to collect data from 5 different sources, 10 different sources, 100 different sources, right? And then with each one of these, you're going to get a JSON that gives you that delivery bill of materials. So what was deployed, where was it deployed, when was it deployed, how was it deployed? And so I think, again, generating that piece of this as well, so that you can ultimately see what happened and when it happened. Again, almost acting as that system of record from a compliance perspective. So guys, just to sort of summarize, sort of what we've walked through, I think, one of the things that I think we'll all agree on is point products do generate a crush of necessary data, right? People, you buy these products for a reason. They are critical to your insulating yourself from security problems or quality problems. We really need to make sure that this data is being evaluated and we're balancing that safety versus velocity. But we're also automating the process of that policy evaluation. Is my SDLC being enforced? How do I know? How do I prove it? Are there circuit breakers in the process that allow me to go ahead and actually stop something when something's identified? So I think, that combined with alerting and exception handling, these things need to be in line, right? I don't want to be running around to 10 different systems looking for these things. I need those systems to do their jobs. I need Sneak or Coverity to produce the information, do the analysis, do its job. But I don't want to be running around to those systems. I want a single point where I can evaluate that end-to-end release against that set of policies. And I think, again, we go back to your tooling needing to support velocity, scale, and security. And I think this is, again, that critical piece here. This is really where OpsMx can come in and really help with those bits and making sure that you're able to accomplish those things safely and securely. So with that said, I think I'm at the end of my deck.
All right. Hey, Bob. And please, anybody questions, please enter them in the chat. More than happy to answer them. You mentioned while we're waiting for any questions, you talked about this concept of vulnerability alerts, not necessarily being static, that once they're deployed, you can have newly found vulnerabilities in software that's already deployed out into the environment, into the cloud. How, are changes to the SBOM? So how does that get, with a solution like this, how does that get managed or notified? Because you might have, that change might happen to many different servers in many different places. To have visually some representation of that would be of interest, I would imagine.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think, the cornerstone of that need is around the fact that vulnerabilities are being identified every day. It's such a dynamic landscape, right? Like, you may have a version of an open source project where when you deployed it, there were 3 vulnerabilities that were identified. Though most of them were benign, they were, medium to low. But a new vulnerability and exploit may have been identified for that version. So the idea that we have the data around what version of what software was deployed where is because we are injecting ourselves into that software delivery pipeline. We're collecting that information. We have what we need to constantly be getting updates around that. And then because we're working in tight coordination with the delivery system, we know the what and where of the deployment. So once we move away from the deployment system on our right of deploy, we have all the necessary data to constantly evaluate any new threats around what is currently active, right? So we're constantly bumping it up against your sneak tooling, or where, if you don't have any of that stuff and we're using something like Guac to ultimately go ahead, or Trevi to ultimately look at what are the new vulnerabilities that are being reported. All we need to know as part of that is what net new dependencies were deployed there, and understand sort of what we're looking for. Because we have that data, because we're in that data path around that deployment, we can constantly be updating those things. And so, I think some of those things are critical as you want to go through and say, hey, I need to not only make sure at time of deployment this is safe, but I want to make sure that I prioritize a security patch should something else pop up, based on the dynamic landscape of the vulnerability landscape of any either open source or sort of proprietary software.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, the other sort of key kind of issue I find is with security and compliance. How can you implement these policies while still enabling your dev teams to run autonomously and fast and quick?
Yeah, I mean,
Can you have both? I think that's the
yeah,
question.
and that's the eternal question, right? Because that's ultimately your utopia, right? I think in my years in this business, both as a SaaS operator and being on the other side of this from a security perspective, getting to that place where you can get to true continuous delivery, that is, especially in the SaaS model, one of the driving factors that customers are looking for, right? So that idea that they don't have to worry about updates and upgrades, they get the latest and greatest features. However, getting to that posture is extremely hard for these reasons, for the security reasons, right? There's, security and code quality are typically the 2 top reasons that hold companies back when it comes to getting to true continuous delivery. Having adequate automated test coverage and making sure that you're not releasing, horrifyingly bad bugs. But most customers are able to deal with that, and most companies are able to deal with that. But it's then the security of those things, right? So where are the circuit breakers in my process that make sure that I am, not violating any of my own policies that are written in the SDLC, or that I'm not unnecessarily exposing my customers to something that they're going to read about in the Wall Street Journal tomorrow, right? You need to be able to do that. You need to be able to document that. And again, this also extends to people that are in heavily regulated environments. If I'm in the banking industry, and I'm using software, from a SaaS vendor, my expectation is they're going to be able to prove all this to me. I'm not going to take their word for it. And so being able to generate those things, there's a real cost to trying to figure out how to do this on your own, right? Managing spreadsheets for CVEs and managing, having things like go, no go for releases are, sort of more traditional ways of thinking about these things. But when you try and do this at velocity, where you're saying, hey, I want to optimize the amount of time it takes for a new idea to get from the whiteboard in one of my engineers' office out to where it's now producing value for my customer, you have to have a system like this that's going to allow you to set off those circuit breakers in the event that there's a problem.
Yeah, it will actually speed things up, right? Because it will give
Exactly.
people
It allows you,
confidence.
yeah, it allows you to operate at speed, because the assumption is that everything is, 99% of the time, everything will be fine, right? It's
Right.
that 1% that you're defending against. And if you can make sure that 99% of the time you're operating at optimal velocity, but you've got the safety and security, along with the, by the way, the ability to prove that you're enforcing these things. This can be very abstract. I'll tell a story where I've been through several of these compliance certification audits, and you'll talk to an auditor about this, but most of these auditors they're auditors. They're not on the cutting edge of technology. So you have to show them, right? They're not just going to say, hey, I took Bob's word for it that they're doing X, Y, or Z, right? They want to see it. And so that's the other piece of this really that I think is super critical.
Yeah, if anything, with this in place, you could take more risk, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And again, I think it lends itself to, and by definition, operating at velocity is a risky proposition, right? And so now you're in
Yes.
the risk management business, and that's sort of what we're bringing to the table.
Well, great, Bob. Hey, I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody for their time today. Bob, really appreciate it. I think our attendees probably got some really valuable insights and information. And with that, I want to wish everybody a happy, productive day. Bob, have a good one. We'll talk to everybody. We'll see you later,
Excellent.
huh?
Thanks all. Take care.
Bye bye.